definitely keep her in prayer then.
And so I told her they're gonna have they have church too. She goes to that what's the name of it? Living Waters. That's where she goes. But she's been there for years. I told her at least she's my age, maybe a few days older than I am. And so that's the name of them.
Will do.
She has Mrs. Church, she does. Praise the Lord.
What was yours? Maybe them. All right. Sure. Come on up. Any others?
And I have some wish lists too.
Okay. Deacons and ministers want to come up and help. We'll have prayer for Brother Rob and anoint him, and then pray for all these requests that were voiced out tonight too.
Praise the Lord. God is my praise. We pray for his goodness, Lord. I pray for his success and godliness, Lord. I pray, Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus, give him victory, oh God. I pray. Lord, oh God, pray for healing for him, Lord. Jesus, by your stripes we are healed, our Lord. And I ask God your blessing on him now. Heal his body. Fill this meeting, I pray, Lord Jesus. Wonderful God, heal his body. Thank you, good Lord. Bless the name of the Lord. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Praise the Lord.
Thank you. Praise your Father.
One thing I want to say, I'm glad to see that yes, he did.
The pulpit, I guess. You like that one better?
So long the Lord is behind. You know what that means?
Yeah. You can hide behind that one.
I like
You can hide stuff behind it too. You don't really know what we're doing back there. Can't get away with it. You can't get away with it with this one, but that
don't
one.
want to do that.
That's where some of the pastors keep their breakfast down there.
You better do that tomorrow.
Last time I taught, we were in 1 Samuel chapter 7, and we'll need a little refresher. So y'all can turn back to chapter 7 and just shout out some highlights from chapter 7. I need a reminder what we went over. One big thing happened. Covered the what? I don't know if it was that one or the week before. I don't remember. It was probably, I think it was that one. Because this is the chapter, this is the one big thing that happened was that Samuel was made judge officially over Israel. So we did talk a little bit about the branches of government. What else happened? Because he was made judge, what did Israel do?
You said chapter 7?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I am in. I see chapter.
Are you 1 Samuel? Some folks have been accidentally going to 2 Samuel, but it's 1 Samuel.
I know. I got some.
I'm gonna get this mic right in a minute. Well, with Samuel being judge, they fought against the Philistines and they won, which was a drastic difference from what happened the last time that they fought against the Philistines. So they were freed from under the hand of the Philistines. Basically, Israel made everything right. God raised up Samuel or used him as a judge, the way things seem to always go. And then Israel was delivered from their captors, the Philistines. But knowing the cycle of Israel, what inevitably is going to happen since they have a judge and everything is great and they've been delivered from the enemy, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to mess up. It's time for the cycle to repeat itself again. Chapter 8 is actually a really important chapter. It's one of my favorite ones. It's just one I guess I focus on a lot because, like, the whole world changes in this chapter. The history of Israel changes in this chapter. So, first two questions I've got tonight for us to think about is a king. We're going to speak a little bit about a king tonight, and I would kind of like your opinion on what makes a king great. What would make a great king? I know in America we're not real familiar with kings, and that's a good thing. But in your mind, what makes a king great? A great king? Leader? Cares about the people? All right, recognizes the Lord and serves the Lord. Let's think more back in our history. You could probably come up with many kings that you would know, like King George or whatever kings you can think of from history. Some of those kings were considered to be great kings. Some were considered to be bad kings. What traits come to mind that made the kings great? Those types of kings. Okay. Being fair to all people. Okay. Yeah. To be a good listener. I think of things like power. I mean, good kings are going to do good things too, but then, like, what makes a king legendary, like great? What would make a king to be remembered? And I guess I think of, the title, I think of, like, their power, maybe how many countries they've taken over, those types of things would make a king considered to be great. What makes, if you were to go back into the book of Judges, or just think of some judges you know in the Bible, what would make a judge great? Can you think of some good judges? I mean, technically they were all pretty good, but which ones stand out to you? Samuel? Thanks. Other than him, Samson was the one that stood out. What did he do that was so great? That's right. He was a man of strength. He slaughtered a lot of Philistines with just the jawbone of a donkey. And he did mess up. He wasn't perfect. But in the end, he redeemed himself, right? And he went out of this life still serving Israel and working for Israel and gave his life for them. Is there any other judges you can think of come to mind? Tell us about Deborah. Yep. I am not an expert in all the judges. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. I don't know about Ehud. Okay. So what about these that made them great? Let's get back to that. Like, what did you like about Deborah? Uh-huh. And if I'm not mistaken, he killed him. He killed him and then went out the window, right? Left the door locked. Nobody knew about it. Nobody knew that he was dead for a long time. He snuck out a window and. Which one? What? Oh, okay. You left that part out, Uncle Bill. Well, I tell you what, it's been 13 minutes. We hadn't got past the first 2 lines of my notes. Probably need to get this thing going here. Who? Yeah. Gideon, that's another one that I think of too. But I noticed like these judges weren't on thrones and didn't have, majestic outfits and all the wealth in the world and things that you would think make kings great. They just did what they were told. They were leaders. A lot of times they led in battle. I fall short of calling them a deliverer because it seemed like God did the delivering. The judges just were like the messengers, right? They were kind of God's hands, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Exactly. They listened to the Lord. And he makes a good point. Normally it was just everyday average Joes that got raised up to be a judge, right? It wasn't some like, wow, look at that guy. He looks like a judge. He would raise up all kinds of people. Usually he would raise up people we probably wouldn't have. Let's get into Scripture real quick. Chapter 8, verse 1 starts off and it says, "And it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel." Sounds a lot like Eli, right? He made his sons, but they weren't necessarily judges more than they were priests, and I want you to keep that in mind. But in verse 2 it said, "Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second was Abiah, and they were judges in Beersheba." Does that name ring a bell? You ever heard of Beersheba before? It's a place where Abraham dug a well there. There's a lot of history in Beersheba. It's also like the southernmost point of Israel. Anyway, that's where they judged. And it said in verse 3 that his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment. And in verse 4 it said, "Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah and said unto him, Behold, thou art old. Your sons walk not in your ways. Make us a king to judge us like all the other nations." If we back up, I think it's really interesting. It's something that I spent some time thinking about was, why did God come down and say, Eli, because of your sons, I'm just going to completely wipe your family off. Like you're going to cease to exist. But with Samuel, that didn't happen. Why? You got any opinions on that? I mean, I like Samuel too, right? But at the same time, you're talking about a just God. Why did he seem to favor Samuel and not? Why didn't Samuel suffer the same punishment Eli did if he had wicked sons too? He did. I gave you a hint, didn't I? That's what stuck out to me was that, Samuel's sons were judges, but Eli's sons were like doing the sacrifice, man. They were priests. People were coming to them, and they had a really important job. Not that a judge isn't important, but I just felt like there's a difference between a priest and a judge. And when you pervert the priesthood and you're stealing sacrifice from God, that might be different than taking a bribe and making a judgment. So I don't know if that's it. It also says that that Samuel grew old, and then his sons didn't walk after his ways. So maybe this is something that happened once Samuel became old. With Eli, we know that it was something he knew about and continually didn't do anything about. So I'm not sure that that's exactly the same thing with Samuel either. But it was just something that sticks out to me, and I wanted to bring up tonight, that there's something different there.
He also knew that his sons were not spiritually qualified, but he goes ahead and he wasn't perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're put in a position, and they're taking bribes and what it calls lucre, which is dirty money, basically. And they perverted judgment, meaning they didn't give a fair or honest judgment. And I guess the elders of Israel take it upon themselves, and they're sick of it. And I don't know. I don't guess I blame them, because time after time we've seen this. Just in this book alone, we see where Eli's sons were doing what they were doing, and then they finally get Samuel for a little while, and he has sons, and now they're corrupt. And it's like Israel's like, I'm sick of this. What are we going to do? The elders come up with this idea that they want a king, and that's where everything begins. I have highlighted in yellow, and it's, to me, the theme of the whole book, and you'll hear me repeat it over and over again. We now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And I have highlighted us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us, and Samuel prayed unto the Lord. Samuel's not happy about it. I think he's a little offended by it. And it's interesting, too, that Samuel, when he's displeased, he's offended or whatever, he goes to the Lord about it. And maybe that's a good example for us sometimes. When we are offended and feel that way, maybe we should be going and praying to the Lord too. So, why ask for a king? Why not ask for a judge? Why didn't they say, Sam, you're getting old, your sons aren't doing right, we need another judge? Why did they specifically ask for a king? That's it, guys. I mean, that's really what it boils down to, is they wanted to be like other nations. They wanted to have what other nations had. Again, that's the running theme in this book, and you're going to see just how dangerous it is to have that attitude. And make no mistake, that attitude's here and alive today, right? We all struggle with wanting to have what other people have, or we want to be like other people. But you can take this lesson, and you can, I would say tonight at least, think about it as your church. As far as the church and the way that it functions, do we get caught up in trying to be like other churches and do what other churches do and try to be like them? I think we're going to find that that's kind of a dangerous place to be. We already talked a little bit about the difference between a judge and a king, but I wanted to reiterate what we talked about last time, was that when we talked about the branches of government, the judge really doesn't make law, right? Samuel didn't create laws. Who created laws? God created the law. He didn't really even carry out punishment for the law. He just said, this is the law. This is what you're supposed to do. If you don't do it, this is what's going to happen. God made the law, and God carried out the sentence. If Samuel said, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen, God would make that happen. So the judge was kind of limited as far as power and I guess an authority. He definitely was a leader, but he didn't make law, and I think that's extremely important. What about a king? What's a king's job? I mean, he's the ultimate power in the land, right? Does a king make law? He is the law, right? I mean, he talks. That's the law, right? He sticks his ring and seals it. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? He was a king, right? He just said, this is how it's going to be, and that was law. And the whole land had to follow that. That's the kind of power a king has. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. I think so, and we're going to actually read some stuff here in just a minute that I think proves that to be true. So before we go much further than that too, is that, say you're in a position where there is a king, right? I think of today's time. Israel was a different time, and it was a different government. It was a different type of nation, right? But think about today and the nation we live in, the government we live under. We have a a president of the United States. We have a law that we're supposed to abide by that wasn't God-given necessarily. It was man-made. If you don't follow the law, there's punishment. Can we still live with a president or with a government and still have God be our king? Is that possible to do? And there's not really an answer for that right now, but it's just something I want you to think about. Can God still be the king of your life even though you live under a government in your country? Tell us more. Mm-hmm. So you're not doomed if you live under a government then. You can still make God the king of your life. One thing that's interesting about our government, though, our forefathers put this together. What are some of our basic rights as human beings living in America? What do the Bill of Rights do? What does our Constitution state? And what our government basically and generally says, who gives us our rights? God gives us our rights, right? God gave us the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence speaks about there being inalienable rights. It talks about that these rights were given by our Creator, is what it says. And the government's just in place to protect us from someone trying to take that from us. But the government doesn't give us our rights. Our government actually claims that our rights come from the Creator, which would be God. And I think that that's pretty awesome because it, in a way, keeps God as a king, so to speak, in a way, in our government. Maybe more so than other governments get to have. Anyway, so keep that in mind. I think God can still be the king of your life today, even though you are under a government. But think about how and why. The people didn't want a king like what God told them. They wanted a king like other nations. They're asking Samuel to make a king because he's the leader. That was the other question I had. Why are they coming to Samuel about this? Why didn't they just raise up a king? But they actually went to Samuel and said, make us a king. So you're like, why is Samuel in charge of making kings? Why is he a kingmaker? And the only thing I could think of there too was that he was the leader in the land, and he had kind of endowed that leadership to his son, so he had the power to pass that leadership role on. So they're like, your sons didn't work, pass it on to somebody else and make him a king. And that's kind of why I think Samuel was in charge of doing this. Do you think that God is not happy with Israel having a king? I studied this and I was a little surprised by it myself. I'm surprised I never realized it before. Is God displeased with Israel having a king? Is that against his wishes? Does he not want Israel to have a king? He's not happy about it in this chapter, that's for sure. But we're going to dig in a little bit and see why. If you'll go to Deuteronomy chapter 17, Deuteronomy, when it was written by Moses, this is a book about the law. And there's some interesting scripture in here. If you go to chapter 17, verse 14, in 14 it says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, which would be Canaan, and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him. He is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left, then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So God actually had set up a plan for there to be a king in Israel, believe it or not, back in Deuteronomy. He actually assumed that when they took over the land that they would want a king, and he was kind of creating the specifications for when this happens, this is what rules you need to abide by when you do that. Because yeah. So it's yes. Do what? I mean, that's kind of where we're going to get to tonight, right? Is what happened to this? Well, what happened to this? God was very specific about their king because kings have ultimate power. And with ultimate power, it's really dangerous to give a man ultimate power, is it not? I mean, I would think all the men in here are good men. But you'd be surprised what ultimate power can do to you. It can corrupt you. It can do all kinds of things to you. So when you put the ultimate power in the hands of a man, a human being, you're kind of asking for trouble. And God was saying, if you'll do these things, it will work. However, the people of Israel are going to need to be like living for God, right? I mean, for them to even know that this exists, but for them to want to follow these rules, they're going to have to be in a good place. Also, the repercussions for having a king versus a judge. So if a judge is corrupt, like Samuel's sons, maybe they're corrupt. What's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to be some injustices in the land, which isn't great. But the law's not corrupted, right? You know, the repercussions are mild, I guess. But a king that's corrupt? I mean, what happens if you go against a king? What happens if you make a king mad? It's over for you, right? That permanent, yeah. So I don't know. It's a good question. I feel like going back to what we could have, but it goes back to what you're saying. Like if you sought God over this situation, God would just raise up another one, right? It's a great question. Right. Which was dangerous times for Israel. Right.
But it's dangerous to reject the man that God put in place.
It is. And David knew that really well. I never seen anybody work so hard not to come against a man that God anointed than David. But do you think just the repercussions of having a king versus a judge, if you have a little more freedom with a judge, with God's in control, if you go against the judge, he's not going to cut your head off. He can't corrupt the law because it comes from God. When a king gets in the way, king can make whatever law he wants, corrupt whatever law he wants. If he's corruptible, the whole nation's in trouble. And you come against him, like if a judge is trying to be corrupt, whatever, you can still abide by the law and move on. If the king is corrupt, then you got to do whatever the king says or you're going to die. And again, I think of Nebuchadnezzar, right? We had 3 guys that had to stand up and not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar, and that's what they faced, was getting thrown in the furnace. I mean, and so anyway, putting a human being in that position is kind of a big deal and a dangerous thing, and God put the schematic out about, you know, if you do this, this is how you need to do it. But I think the people were so astray from God at the time that this just didn't matter, and they just wanted a king. So going a little bit further in verse 7, it said, the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So right here, God specifically states that he considered himself king and that he reigned over Israel. And by standing up a king, he would no longer reign over them. That's exactly what this verse says. And he considers this a rejection of him. That's what he says. Yeah, I mean, if God's in charge, as a theocratic government. When you have a king, I guess it becomes a monarchy, right? Yep. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. And that's just not a testimony you want God to have about you. I mean, over and over again, Israel's done this, and that's what God said. In summary, he just says, everything I've done for them, from the day I took them out of Egypt, they have continually forsaken me. They've continually served other gods. And right now, they're just doing the same thing to you. They're forsaking you. They're wanting to serve somebody else. But he's basically saying they've been doing this since they left Egypt. And God brings Egypt up a lot, especially in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, therefore, hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. So God is like, no, Samuel, I know, but we're going to do what they want. Yep, that's a big lesson in this too that we need to talk about, is the fact that they're asking for something. It displeases Samuel. Samuel, I think, knows that this isn't right. God knows it's not right. God comes right out and says, this is a plain rejection of me, and I will no longer reign over them. That's what they want. At the same time, he could say no, but he doesn't, does he? He says, let's go ahead and do it. Let's do what they want to do. But he says not only do what they want to do, but he does say to solemnly protest, or protest solemnly unto them, and basically show them the manner show them what's going to happen if they have a king. That's what God tells Samuel to do. Now that's interesting too, right? Why is God just letting them do what they want? Anybody got any ideas on that? Isn't it amazing how offended God can be, but at the same time turn right around and show mercy like that? And you see that repeatedly with God. You see it repeatedly with Jesus. And I personally take that as a challenge and a lesson in my life. Like, I feel that's how I'm supposed to be. I want to be where someone can offend me, maybe upset me or hurt my feelings or whatever, and get me to that place where I don't want to do a thing nice for that person. And in that moment, still be able to. Like, that's a challenge. I feel like that's where I'm supposed to be. That's what I feel like Jesus wants me to do. And we see that right here. God's like offended. You don't want me to be your king, and you've forsaken me continually, and I've taken care of you continually, and all these things. And that upsets me. But I'm still going to take the time to explain to you, this is what's going to happen. This is, and he gives them a chance. It's, again, shows his mercy and his undying love for his people, that he spends the time to try to explain to him what's going to be like with a king, and tries to help him make a wise decision, but ultimately he lets them make the decision. We still have the freedom of choice, and that's, I think, a really important part of being a human being, is that we have to choose God. We have to choose for God to be our king. We have to choose for Jesus to be our Savior. He's not just going to make that happen. And he's going to give you a chance for that. And that's what he's doing here. He's giving them a chance to change their mind, giving them a chance to make the right decision, despite the fact that he's very offended by what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Does he still give us these opportunities today? Does he still do that today? Have you ever been in a situation like Sister Teresa's talking about where maybe you want to do something, or maybe you feel a calling to do something. Maybe you're too scared or you don't want to, and you pull away from it even though God's given you a chance and he's trying to convince you. You ever been in that situation where you just didn't listen to him? You felt like God was trying to point you in the right direction and you just wouldn't listen and you just wouldn't do it? And I know I've been there plenty of times, and I always can turn around and look and say, I know for sure what God was trying to tell me to do, and if I'd have done it, I'd have skipped all of this mess. But I wouldn't do it. That's the way it works. And I truly believe, too, that if you decide that you're just going to ignore God, eventually he's just going to let you do whatever you want to do, and conviction begins to wear away. Doesn't affect you the way that it used to, and he kind of turns you over to that, just do whatever you want to do. And that's a dangerous, dangerous place to be in. You don't want to allow that to happen to yourself. But he tells Samuel, go ahead and tell him what it's going to be like to have a king. And in verse 10, it said, Samuel told all the words of the Lord and of the people that asked him a king. He said, this will be the manner of the king. And remember, this isn't the manner of the king that God spoke about in Deuteronomy. This is the manner of the king like all nations have. If you want a king like what everybody else has, this is what it's going to be like. He's going to reign over you. He's going to take your sons. He's going to appoint them for himself, for his chariots, to be his horsemen. Some shall run before his chariots. He will appoint him captains over thousands, captains over 50s. He will set them to ear his ground, to reap his harvest, to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. He will take your fields, your vineyards, your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers, to his servants. He will take your men servants and your maid servants, your goodliest young men, your asses, and put them to work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. Sounds like a real good change, right? What do you think Israel's reaction is going to be? I don't care. I don't care. Nevertheless, we want a king. Really makes me think of when Jesus is before Pilate, and they're crucify him. Pilate's like, he ain't done nothing wrong, guys. We don't care. Crucify him anyway. Well, how about this? Choose between him and this murderer. Release the murderer. Crucify him. You're like, holy cow, how stubborn are you? How you don't listen to reason, you're not open-hearted. Like it's crazy, but that's Israel's attitude here, and you see it here. So to summarize the characteristics, number one, he says a king is going to want to build a large army. He's going to want a large entourage of officials, attendants, and servants. He's going to want all the trappings of royalty. He's going to want wealth and luxury and honor and the best of everything. He's going to want absolute control over the people. The Lord's instructions to Samuel demonstrate that some of these requirements from the law weren't going to be followed. Well, I mean the law, I mean Deuteronomy. Obviously, the king that they're wanting is not going to be the king of Deuteronomy, the way it talks about. Nevertheless, the Israelites were about to put their security, their safety, their comfort into a king. While the Israelites might have enjoyed boasting, think about that, boasting in their king and his splendor. They probably hoped that his army would be intimidating against people like the Ammonites. There were some dangerous shifts about to take place. Number one, it wasn't a rejection of other human leaders, but this is a straight rejection of God. It represented a move from God-chosen style of leadership to a man-chosen style of leadership. Even though God selected Saul, it wasn't God's choice for them to have a king at all at this point, the way the people were. It represented a move from a task-based and gift-oriented leadership to a leadership based on position, royalty, and tenure. Right? So kind of concrete in some of the differences between our judges and kings. Those judges, they were made great because of the tasks that they did and the gifts that they gave Israel. But a king is going to be great because of their royalty, their position, and their tenure. Some of the future kings may be kings simply because they were the son of the last king, right? It established royalty overhead. It's expensive to be a great king, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about? You ever been a great king? It's expensive. Just take my word for it. It takes a lot of taxes. It's a lot of overhead. So you're going to have a lot of taxation forced into this, right? And you could read through the scripture, a tenth of this, and a tenth of that, and a tenth of this, and a tenth of that. It represented a significant introduction of worldliness into Israel. I think that's really key, because if you're wanting a king like all the other nations have, then what you're saying is we want a worldly king. And I don't know that Israel really needs to introduce a bunch of worldliness into their nation, but that's what they're doing. So it introduces a major worldliness component into the nation of Israel, which is a slippery slope. And it reduced all of Israel to being basically the slaves of the king, meaning that they're going to have to follow and do everything the king says. I wrote here that with God as your king, there's freedom. As Jesus as your Lord and Savior and your king, there's freedom. Paul talks about it all the time, the liberty in Christ, the freedom there is in serving Christ. But Samuel shows here how much freedom there lacks by having a human king, or taking God out of the place of kingship and putting a man in there. I don't like the idea of being a servant. I don't know about y'all, but I couldn't listen to all that and go, yeah, that's what we want. Let's do that. In verse 18 it said, ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Does that sound familiar? We see God do that a lot too. But he's saying when you realize that this was a bad choice, it's going to be too late. And you're going to have wandered away from God again, and you're not going to be able to just cry out and get it fixed. But in 19 it said, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, nay, nay, we will have a king over us. That is, it's quite a mindset. It's almost a spiritual, it's like a spirit or an attitude that I see today too. People have that type of mindset today. They have that kind of, I call it almost like a hard-heartedness. God's called them a stiff-necked people too. And this is exactly what he's talking about, being stiff-necked. I think it's easy for us to look at this and go, man, that's dumb. Why were they acting like that? It's not so easy for us to realize that we can be this way too, right? It's like I want to walk around and be like, hey, you remember how Israel acted? You're acting that way right now. You don't know you're being dumb. Exactly. You don't realize. Like, you think this is limited back in that day, but this attitude is still here, very present today. That hard-heartedness, this I don't want to hear what you have to say. I've made my mind up. This is how it is, and there's nothing you can tell me that would change my mind. And I don't think that that's a good attitude to have. I think that we need to be able to, I love to be able to hear all points of view from all different sides. There's nobody going to tell me how it is. No person's going to come tell me something, and I'm just going to take it to the bank. I'm going to figure that out for myself. But in order for me to figure that out for myself, I need to hear from everybody, right? I want to hear from the side that nobody wants to talk to. I want to see what their point of view is. I want to understand why they think that way. And I want to hear about this side too. And I like to go into every conversation and conflict or whatever with a very open mind and hear everything and try to understand it and get to the root of it. And I think you have to be that way, especially with the Word of God, right? You might have been told something your whole life, and you just took it to the bank. And you get into the Word, what happens if it doesn't seem to be what you were taught your whole life? That happens. Are you just going to say, I'm stiff-necked and I'm just going to go with what I always thought? Or are you going to be open-minded and say, God, speak to me. I want to know what you're saying. I want to understand this. Maybe this isn't the way that I always thought it was. That's important. Don't be stiff-necked with God. You've got to be open-hearted and let God speak to you. Otherwise, you're being just like Israel, and you don't even know it. You don't even realize it. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "Nay, we will have a king over us." Pride causes this. In verse 20, they go on to say that we also may be like all the nations. So you see that phrase come up again. They're really, really, really interested in being like all the other nations for some reason. And that our king may judge us. So he's going to do king stuff plus the judging, that he judges, but more importantly than that he goes out before us in a majestic manner, somebody we can be proud of and get behind. He's going to go out before us. He's going to fight our battles for us. And be just like they see all the other nations do. Mm-hmm. That's right. It's not going to be him. I remember Saul trying to fight a battle when Goliath was out there, and it wasn't going too good for him. Yeah, and for whatever reason, that song, "This Is How I Fight Our Battles," comes to mind too. And I keep thinking how dumb it would look if we were all singing this song, "This is how I fight my battles," and we're talking about a king, like a human king. How lame that is compared to the way that we sing it is God fights our battles. And that's totally different. I see the same spirit that they had when they were like, "Bring the ark out to this battle. That'll win the fight. This is how we fight our battles. Bring that ark out here." Like, they don't get it. They don't understand. It doesn't seem like. A man's not going to do any better than the ark does without God. So, again, we see them wanting to be like others. They kind of speak as though having a judge is kind of shameful. I noticed they're kind of like embarrassed that they have a judge instead of a king. Like, we're tired of this. We want to have the newest model leader. We want a king. The days of having judges, we're just over that. Like, we're past that. They also find, I was wondering, do they find security in something visible and tangible? But Israel seemed to always consistently have trouble trusting in God. Right? They would get in trouble and they'd be like, "Now what are we going to do?" But God would always be there to take care of them. And it's like they had a real issue with having faith and trust in God. But with a king is someone they could see. A king, someone they could touch. A king, someone they could go up and talk to. And maybe they just felt more comfortable or like more secure in having something they could see and touch versus God. But what that all goes back to is a lack of faith. That's what faith is. That's what faith is. If you feel like you've got to see and touch Christ and he's got to be standing right in front of you, then you missed it, right? I mean, he even told us that about doubting Thomas. And you know what he said about that. So faith is paramount here, and Israel is missing it big time. In 21, it says, Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Hearken unto their voice, make them a king." Samuel said unto the men of Israel, "Go ye every man unto his city." And conversation's over. God told Samuel, "Do it. Tell him what it's going to be like." He told him what it'd be like. Israel said, "Don't care. We want a king." Samuel told God. God said, "Let's make him a king." And Samuel said, "Okay, that's what we're going to do. You can go back home." And then we'll get to find out how that happens. So we've only got a few minutes left. My final thoughts for tonight. I guess my final thoughts is something we've already discussed a little bit, but was why did God allow Israel to have a king? I mean, after this first king gets stood up, there will be no more judges. Just be kings. That's like the next book of the Bible, right? After Samuel. Say again. Okay. Learn a lesson. He did. That power of choice. Absolutely. Whether you like it or not, you're responsible for your own choice, what your decisions are. And you can blame it on your upbringing. You can blame it on your parents. You can blame it on all kinds of stuff in this life. But ultimately, you're going to be given an opportunity to make God your king. And you've got to make that choice. And that choice is yours and yours alone. God's not going to make it for you. Nobody else can make it for you either. And I guess that was kind of my last thought as far as why did he allow it to happen, but does he still allow those types of things to happen even today? Does he allow you to make kings in your life today? Is it possible for you to go against God and God let that happen? And if God lets that happen, does that mean it's okay? It's not okay. He does let it happen. And just because he lets it happen, just because he didn't stand in your way, doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't mean that there won't be consequences. It just means that he's letting you do what you want to do. What he wants you to want is him. And you've got to constantly look at yourself and see, do I want him more than I want anything else? If you do, then you won't slip into this trap. But if you don't, you'll realize real quick, God's going to let you do and have what it is that you want. Don't let being like other people be the reason you choose to do something. That's another main lesson in this book or in this chapter. And that goes against all kinds of aspects of your life, right? I mean, just personally, just individually, you shouldn't be that way. There's even laws in the 10 Commandments that speak to thou shalt not covet, things like that. But as a church, I think that's something that I see a lot. I hear a lot is we slip up. We don't mean to, I don't think, but we get caught up in what everybody else is doing. And we want to be like that, or we want to look like that, or we want to act like that. And that's a dangerous place to be. We don't need to be worried about that. We need to be worried about God and what he wants, him reigning over us. And when I said, can you make a king? Can you make God your king despite the fact that you live under a government here in this world, in this nation? And I'll go a step further than that. And this is what I'll leave you with tonight, and you can kind of chew on yourself. I didn't grow up in the church. I got saved when I was about 20. I've only been in the church for 18 years, I think. So I love the church. There's a lot of heritage here, but I hadn't been in it my whole life like some of you all have. And I don't know, I'm not an expert in the history, but I understand how the church began. I understand where it started. And I understand everybody has a different attitude towards what the church is. But I don't know how everybody feels about our leadership in church. But you may have felt like there was a point in time in our church that the leader of our church was God appointed. And maybe we were under a theocratic type government church-wise. Has that changed? Was there a point in time where man got involved and we have leaders that were appointed by men rather than God? I don't know. I can't tell you the answer to that. I just know everybody probably has an opinion. But if you feel like that, we're not under a theocratic type leadership government structure in the church today, can God still be king of your life despite that, is the question. And if God can be, how upset are you going to be about it? Like, regardless of leadership, even in the church, doesn't take away the fact that God still can be your king. That doesn't dictate whether God's your king or not. And I think that that's important. No matter what's going on in your life, what's going on in the church, you personally can make God king of your life. And you need to make that a priority, and you need to take your own responsibility in that and make God king of your life despite everything that's going on. And realize there's a difference. There's a difference in the two. So I'll leave that with you to chew on. Is there any other comments or anything you'd like to make about chapter 8 before we dismiss?
Brother Steve, I've seen a prime example of word theocracy as government under the direction of God. Yet I've seen overseers appointed, and maybe there was several strong churches in the state. And after the convention, you found a son-in-law, and you wonder, is this theocracy?
Right. It's a good point, something that you've got to think about. And as hopeless as that makes you feel, there needs to be hope in understanding that that has nothing to do with God being your king in your life. Right. There he is. And I think everybody that makes king of, what do you call a group of people? Because there's going to be people all over the world right now that despite their government, despite their church, God is king over their life. Now, what do you call, if you gathered all those people that God's king of their life truly, and you gather all those together, what would you call that group of people? And it's everywhere. And it's like a church inside a church.
If Satan was going to put a name in anything, he'd put it in a church.
Sure. You would think he couldn't, but that would be right where he would do it. So there's hope there. I think the most important thing is that you make God king over your life, and you'll see how all this stuff will come together in the end. So. It's very possible. I don't think that we need to do things just to prove ourselves, but I think there are things that we, I think of Meshach, Bendigo, and who's the other one? Shadrach. I don't think that they were trying to prove a point, but they had finally, things had come to the point where they were going to stand out like a sore thumb. Yeah. Right. There'll come a time probably where you're going to have to make a decision, and you're just going to have to be willing to do what you're supposed to do, and you're just going to end up standing out. And that's where people are going to be like, I don't know if I really want to do this or not. So it's not so much of I'm going to go out and prove something or be prideful about it. It's just I can't do this because God is my king, and there may be a time where that becomes very evident, and it's going to be very uncomfortable to do. Yeah. Things that I'm not real worried about, though, are things like the Word of God, worship, prayer, my relationship with Christ, because those things don't depend on freedom. I can worship in the jail cell. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we can get to a point where it's going to be very frustrating to be a Christian. It's going to be very sorrowful to be a Christian, but there's no person that's going to be able to take away your relationship with Christ or your ability to worship or your ability to pray. You'll always have that. You don't have to do it in a church building. You can do that wherever you are. Nobody can take that from you. Doesn't mean that it won't be a very sorrowful day if you can't go to church, you can't be around your church family, or you can't preach the gospel, or you can't do whatever. But nobody's going to be able to take away what you have with Christ. And that's why we don't need to take it for granted today when things are good and easy. We need to make that a priority. And in the day that that happens, we'll know what it means for Christ to be our King. We'll know what it means to, I don't have to go to a church building to have this relationship with Him, and you can survive without it. And we've kind of gotten a taste of it already with this pandemic. Were you able to still have that relationship with Christ even though you weren't able to come to church for a while? I would imagine that that would probably happen again at some point in time, if I had to guess. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I hope I'm not that way. I could see where if you didn't do a lot of witnessing now, where you wish that you had when you could have, and now you can't. But yeah, you're right. There may be some people that's like, all right, this is nice. I don't have the pressure of doing that. It's a good point. It's a real good point. Any other comments? Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I enjoyed it. Whenever I get to teach again, we'll go right into chapter 9. And if there's not anything else tonight, are there any announcements or anything? All right, y'all are dismissed.